Good evening, distinguished delegates, colleagues, and friends. Today's conversation begins with a simple truth. Displacement does not erase dignity, and it does not silence women's voices. The women whose stories we will hear today were forced to leave their homes in Artsakh, yet they continue to lead, serve, and advocate for justice for their communities. On behalf of the Armenian Relief Society, it is my honor to welcome you to today's discussion titled, From Displacement to Justice, Strengthening Protection, Rights, and Recovery for Conflict-Affected Women and Girls. We gather during the 70th session of the Commission on the Status of Women, where the international community is examining how justice systems and institutions can better protect women and girls affected by conflict and displacement. Across the world today, millions of women and girls are displaced due to war and conflict. They lose homes, livelihoods, security, and often family members. Yet despite these challenges, women continue to demonstrate remarkable resilience and leadership. The experience of Armenian women displaced from Artsakh, their historic homeland, illustrates these realities vividly. Following the war in 2020 and the events of 2023, more than 150,000 Armenians were forcibly displaced, with women and children representing the majority of those affected. Today's discussion will examine the humanitarian realities faced by displaced women, the lived experiences of those who witnessed displacement firsthand, the legal pathways towards justice, accountability, and recovery. To begin our program, it is my pleasure to invite the chairperson of the Armenian Relief Society, Arusiag Melkonyan, to deliver our opening remarks.
Can you hear me? Distinguished delegates, colleagues, and friends, it is a profound honor to address you today on behalf of the Armenian Relief Society, a women-led humanitarian organization founded in 1910, built on the conviction that solidarity and purposeful action can transform lives. For more than a century, the Armenian Relief Society has stood beside Armenian communities, confronting genocide, displacement, war, and poverty. Across these generations, women have not only endured the greatest hardship, they have been the driving force of survival, resilience, and continuity. Armenian women have carried families through crisis, safeguarded education under the harshest conditions, and rebuilt communities after profound loss. Their strength is not symbolic, it is foundational. At the Armenian Relief Society, our work is rooted in empowerment rather than charity. We invite the girls' education. We invest in girls' education, support women-headed households, and deliver humanitarian, medical, and psychological assistance to displaced women and children. Through our various programs, because equality begins with dignity, safety, and opportunity. The recent forced displacement of Armenians from Artsakh revealed once again a painful truth. Women and children bear the heaviest burden of humanitarian crisis. Their needs must not be sidelined, and their voices must never be silenced. Gender equality cannot be achieved without peace, and peace cannot be achieved without women at the decision-making table. Women must be included not as symbols of suffering, but as architects of recovery, policy, and peace building. As chairperson of the Armenian Relief Society, I reaffirm our commitment to global cooperation and grassroots action. The challenges facing Armenian women reflect a universal reality. When women are empowered, entire communities become stronger, more resilient, and more just. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. reminded us, in the end, we will remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends. Here at CSW, we must choose not silence, but presence, not indifference, but responsibility. Let us move from commitment to action by strengthening women-led organizations, protecting every girl's right to education, and ensuring that no woman becomes invisible in times of crisis. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairperson Melkonian. Unfortunately, our originally scheduled speaker experienced technical difficulties joining us this evening. As is often the case with virtual participation and Zoom connections, these challenges can arise unexpectedly. Fortunately, as with any well-prepared discussion, we have a distinguished colleague ready to step in and continue the important legal perspective of this conversation. Our first panelist brings an essential legal and human rights perspective to today's discussion. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Kebor Hagopjian, Esquire. Dr. Kebor Hagopjian holds a PhD in international law from the University of Vienna and is a licensed attorney at Kiosyan Law, LLP, where his practice focuses on civil litigation, mass torts, and class actions. He has collaborated with international organizations, including KCID, the United Nations Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and the United Nations Development Program. In these roles, he led the International Fellows Program, working with more than 600 global leaders on interreligious dialogue and peace building. With more than 20 years of leadership in civil society, Dr. Hagopjian serves on the board of the Armenian Legal Center for Justice and Human Rights and on the Armenian National Committee of America's Western Region Leadership. He also contributes to the Armenian Bar Association's Pro Bono Legal Clinic. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Kebor Hagopjian via Zoom from Los Angeles, California. Kebor, you're on mute.
Single view gallery. No.
Distinguished panelists, honored delegates. It's my pleasure being with you this afternoon. And I thank the organizers for
Hold on.
Sorry, Kebor, can I stop you 1 second? They can't hear you in the room. Okay.
On the Zoom, the audio, the arrow. There you go.
Try again.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Perfect. So, Gerginan Kampari Erego, good afternoon, ladies, and I hope there is a gentleman in the room. If there isn't, then... Oh, there is. Excellent. Perfect. So, distinguished panelists, honored delegates, imagine waking up one morning to find that the legal architecture meant to protect you, such as the international humanitarian law, CEDAW, the guiding principles on internal displacement or refugees, exist in full on paper, and yet you are homeless. Your husband or your father is a prisoner of war or a hostage in a foreign country. You don't know whether he is alive. You don't know whether their conditions are good enough to survive. Your house has been destroyed, your land confiscated, and you were uprooted from your ancestral lands. And there is no court for redress. This is not a hypothetical. This is the lived legal reality of tens of thousands of indigenous Armenian women from Nagorno-Karabakh, Artsakh, who were displaced, forcibly displaced, first in September 2020 and later on in September 2023. December 2023, pardon. More than 150,000 ethnic Armenians, both in 2020 and 2023, fled within days. More than half of them are women and girls. The Armenian Legal Center for Justice and Human Rights, ALC, moving forward, pursues accountability for victims of this conflict through international legal mechanisms. Today, I want to speak from that legal vantage point, not only to describe suffering, but to name the specific legal obligations being violated with precise figures, and to argue that this Commission and this Convention must treat access to justice not as an aspiration, but as an enforceable standard. I will touch upon 3 rights and 3 failures, with numbers. The CSW70 priority theme asks us to eliminate the structural barriers to justice. Allow me to name 3 structural failures where international law is clear, obligations are binding, and the gap between law and reality is measurable. First, the right to know. Missing persons, missing people, and enforced disappearances. Under the Geneva Conventions and their additional protocols, all parties to an armed conflict have a binding legal duty to search for missing persons, provide information about their fate and whereabouts, and facilitate the return of remains. When the states fail this obligation, the families of missing persons, overwhelmingly mothers, wives, and daughters, suffer a continuing violation of their own rights, such as their right to family life, their right to be free from cruel treatment, and to an effective remedy. Here are the numbers behind that legal failure. 429 persons still are missing from the 2020 war and subsequent hostilities. Only 195 additional missing people emerged from the September 2023 offensive alone. In total, 777 missing people from the First Karabakh War are still unresolved after 3 decades, since early 1990s. That is in total, more than 1,400 people whose fate is unknown to their families across the 2 Karabakh wars, main wars, let's say, and the 2023 displacement. Behind each number is a mother, a wife, a daughter, waiting, and in some cases for more than 30 years. This is not a bureaucratic gap. It is a continuing legal violation recognized as such under the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the jurisprudence of the European Court of Human Rights, and CEDAW General Recommendation 30. ALC, together with partner organizations, has submitted cases before the UN Working Group on Enforced or Involuntary Disappearances and engaged with the European Court of Human Rights precisely because the right to know is not a political courtesy. It is a justiciable right. When legal channels fall silent, women bear the burden alone. The second right is regarding POWs, hostages, and detainees, and the weaponization of legal categories. International humanitarian law is clear. Hostages and prisoners of war must be treated humanely, granted family contact, monitored by neutral actors, and repatriated after active hostilities. These are not aspirational standards. They are binding obligations under the Third Geneva Convention. What has happened in practice, though, is a systematic legal reclassification that transforms these protections into bargaining chips in negotiations. For example, consider the trajectory of acknowledged detainees by Azerbaijan, and I'm here quoting the numbers acknowledged by the Azerbaijani government. So in March 2021, they acknowledged 72 Armenian hostages in Azerbaijani custody. In 2025, 4 years later, they acknowledged 23 detainees, and now, after the January prisoners swap, they confirmed 19 detainees. These declining numbers might appear to indicate progress. They do not. They reflect a deliberate legal strategy. From February 2021 onward, Azerbaijani officials publicly claimed there were no prisoners of war left, because part of the November 8 declarations, they were supposed to release all POWs. What they did, they reclassified the remaining Armenian detainees as criminal suspects. Criminal cases were opened against more than 60 Armenian POWs and civilians, with short trials, sham trials, heavy sentences, and releases tied explicitly to negotiations rather than to legal standards. Critically for this panel, the ICRC ended, which is the Red Cross, ended its physical presence in Azerbaijan in September 2025. The one organization with a mandate to conduct confidential detention monitoring, to be the neutral actor guaranteed by international humanitarian law, and to serve as a bridge between the detainees and their families, their mothers, their wives and daughters, is no longer there. Families of the 19 hostages confirmed remaining detainees now have no independent monitor, no confidential channel, no eyes inside those facilities. This is the worst possible moment for the international community to look away. The third failure is regarding the right to return and reparations. The right of displaced persons to voluntary, safe and dignified return is enshrined in the guiding principles on internal displacement and in CEDAW's General Recommendation 32 on gender-responsive approaches to displacement. Housing, land and property restitution is a core component of reparations under the UN Basic Principles on the right to a remedy. For Artsakh women displaced to Armenia and other countries, none of these rights have a functional mechanism attached to them. There is no restitution process, no property claim body, no international monitoring system with physical access to the territory. So from documentation to adjudication, what ALC does? The ALC's work proceeds from a conviction that international legal mechanisms, imperfect as they are, remain essential tools for communities who have no army, no territory, and no state resources to compel accountability. Let me describe 3 dimensions of our work directly relevant to this panel. First, documentation as a legal foundation. Legal accountability begins with evidence. ALC conducts systematic documentation of violations committed against Armenians across the 2020, the war, the 2022-2023 blockade, and the 2023 displacement. Our documentation includes survivor testimony, open source intelligence, satellite imagery, and forensic methods recognized by international tribunals. Trauma-informed documentation that centers the experience of women survivors is not a methodological preference. It is a legal imperative recognized by the ICC policy on the crime of genocide and its framework for gender-based crimes. The second approach is a strategic litigation through international and regional courts. ALC has been engaged in supporting the European Courts of Human Rights proceedings on behalf of Armenian POWs, hostages, civilian detainees, and displaced persons. The European Courts Rule 39 interim measures framework has been invoked repeatedly to seek information about detainees' faith and to demand safeguards, because without that pressure, acknowledged numbers would be even harder to obtain. The third is the UN system, advocacy and treaty body engagement. ALC engages with Universal Periodic Review submissions, special rapporteurs, communications, and treaty body reviews. We submitted, for example, to the UN Working Group on Enforced or Involuntary Disappearances, highlighting how video evidence of captives in custody can coexist with official denial of their detention, a perverse but legally significant dynamic. We have called for the CEDAW committee to exercise its inquiry procedure under Article 8 of the optional protocol, where there is evidence of grave or systematic violations. The special rapporteurs on the internally displaced people and the working group on disappearances and the special rapporteur on torture all have active mandates with direct application to what is described in this room. Their engagement is not optional, it is required, it is mandatory. So what ALC is calling for? We are calling for 4 calls to this commission. This commission has the opportunity and the responsibility to produce agreed conclusions that close specific accountability gaps and makes sure that perpetrators are held accountable. So on behalf of ALC, we urge the following. First, name the families of the hostages and the POWs and families of the missing people explicitly. The agreed conclusions must recognize that women who are family members of missing persons or involuntarily disappeared people, POWs and hostages, suffer distinct and continuing violations. With over 1,400 persons missing across the Karabakh conflict and 19 confirmed hostages still held, with no independent monitoring mechanism present since Red Cross's departure in September 2025, this commission cannot afford generic language. The states must be called upon to implement the international humanitarian law obligations on missing persons and detainees as legal duties, not as political choices. The second call is to condemn the weaponization of legal categories. The practice of reclassifying POWs and hostages as criminal suspects to extend detention and extract political concessions must be named as violation of international humanitarian law and international human rights law. The agreed conclusions should affirm that domestic criminal proceedings cannot substitute for compliance with POW repatriation under the Third Geneva Convention. Third, integrate the right to return into gender-responsive justice frameworks. Displaced women's access to justice requires legal recognition of housing, land, and property rights that are independent of documentation gaps caused by the displacement itself. The agreed conclusions should call for accessible, gender-sensitive property claims mechanisms and for international support for legal aid to displaced populations. Fourth, address the monitoring vacuum. The Red Cross's departure from Azerbaijan in September 2025 creates a dangerous monitoring gap. The Commission should call on states to facilitate the immediate restoration of independent detention monitoring and on the relevant state to grant the Red Cross and other neutral actors unobstructed access as required under the international humanitarian law. What would be even more important is the call for their unconditioned and immediate release from the unlawful detention and hostage taking. To conclude, justice is not patience. The states are not permitted to remain passive in the face of the suffering of victims of serious violations of international law. This is a quote from the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, articulated by Velázquez Rodriguez. Indeed, the women of Artsakh didn't choose displacement. They didn't choose to have their households taken as their husbands taken as prisoners of war and hostages. Their names entered into a missing persons database. Their properties confiscated. Their right to return suspended indefinitely in the corridors of geopolitics. They chose to survive, and survival, when the legal system functions as it should, is the beginning of a claim, not the end of one. Today, 19 men remain confirmed in Azerbaijani custody, several with life sentences handed down just weeks ago. More than 1,400 families do not know the fate of their loved ones. There is no functioning restitution mechanisms for the property lost by 150,000 displaced Armenians. And the one neutral body mandated to monitor detention has been absent since September 2025. These are not abstract legal failures. They are the daily reality of women in Armenia and in diaspora communities around the world. Women who come to organizations like ours not because they believe in the perfection of international law, but because they believe that the alternative to accountability is silence, and silence is what perpetrators prefer. ALC will continue to file cases, submit reports, document violations, and argue before every available forum until these obligations are met. We ask the Commission to share that commitment in the agreed conclusions, in the follow-through, and in the political will to treat women's access to justice as a non-negotiable foundation of the international order this institution was created to defend. The women of Artsakh are here, their cases are filed, the law is on their side. What they need is for this commission to be on their side too. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kibor. We will now watch a short video presenting an eyewitness account from the perspective of a journalist. The video features Lilit Marivirosyan, an Armenian Relief Society volunteer and journalist who documented the displacement of Armenians from Artsakh as the events unfolded. Let's direct our attention to the screens.
Եվ բռնի տեղանվել եմ Արցախից 2023 թվականի սեպտեմբերի 22-ից հետո։ Մասնագիտության բանասեր եմ, երկար տարիներ աշխատել եմ որպես լրագրող, սկզբից հայրենյաց պաշտպան թերթում, այնուհետև Նոր Շահումյան թերթում որպես ըմբալի։ 2013 թվականից ակտիվ անդամակցել եմ Հայ օգնության միությանը, 2021 թվականին եղել եմ Հայ օգնության միության վարչության ատենապետուհի։ Շրջափակման օրերին մեր կազմակերպությունը ամեն գնով փորձում էր օգնել արցախցիներին, հասնում էր նրանց բոլոր կարիքներին։ Երբ սկսվեց շրջափակումը, մեզ թվում էր, թե մենք հաղթահարենք բոլոր դժվարությունները։ Մենք հաղթահարեցինք սառնամանիքը և քաղցը։ Փորձում էինք ամեն ինչ անել, որպեսզի կարողանանք շարունակել մեր կյանքը մեր հայրենի հողի վրա, չէինք մտածում, որ մենք երբևէ կարող ենք լքել մեր բնորանը։ Այդ օրերին հատկապես շատ զգացվում էր դեղորայքի և սննդամթերքի, առաջին անհրաժեշտության պարենամթերքի կարիք։ Ամենածանրը, որ չես կարողանում այցելել հարազատիդ գերեզման, այնտեղ թողել ենք հայր, եղբայր, տատիկ, պատիկներ, մեր նախահայրերի շիրիմները գտնվում են այնտեղ։ Այսօր մենք զրկված ենք նրանց այցելելու հնարավորությունից, երբ հարկադրաբար պետք է լքեինք մեր տունը, մեր աչքին ոչինչ չէր երևում, միայն սիրելիների կյանք ապարգելը։ Մենք գնում էինք դեպի անորոշություն, մենք չգիտեինք, տեղ կհասնեինք, թե ոչ։ Սարսափելի օրեր էին մեզ սպասվում առջևում։ 3 օր ու գիշեր մենք գտնվեցինք ճանապարհին։ Մենք անցանք դժոխքի միջով եւ դուրս եկանք դժոխքից մեր հոգում կրելով անջնջելի ցավը։ Իմ հիշողությունից երբեք չի ջնջվում 3 օր ու գիշեր տևող գաղթի ճանապարհը։ Ամենուրեք սովալում դեմքեր, մանուկներ, ծերեր, իսաքաղց, հիծված, որոնք գնում էին դժոխքի միջով, այդ ճանապարհով չմտածելով, որ կարող է երբևէ տեղ հասնել։ Մանուկների լացը, ծերերի հոգոց սառաչանքները ուղեկցում են մինչև հիմա ինձ, իմ հիշողությունները։ Հենց առաջինը, երբ արդեն հատեցինք հակարի կամուրջը, հասկացանք, որ արդեն փրկվել ենք եւ մենք պետք է շարունակենք հապել։ Մեզ շատ օգնեց մեր հայրենակիցների աջակցությունը, նրանց նվիրվածությունը, ամենուրեք մեզ դիմավորում էին մեծ խանդավառությամբ եւ պատրաստական օգնելու ամեն ինչով որ կարող էին, բայց առաջնահերթությունը մեզ համար գիշերելու տեղ գտնելն էր, որովհետև չունեինք ոչինչ եւ չգիտեինք, թե ուր են գնում եւ ուր պետք է հասնենք։ Հենց մեր հարազատների, մեր հայրենակիցների շնորհիվ կարողացանք գտնել մեր օթևանը եւ հասկացանք, որ պետք է ապրենք։ Այսօր մենք ապագայի հանդեպ չունենք վստահություն եւ դա ամենամեծ անորոշությունն է, որ մեզ միշտ ուղղակցում է։ Ես միշտ կարծել եմ, որ Արցախն է տարածաշրջանում համեմատաբար խաղաղություն եւ կայունություն պահող պատը։ Այսօր այդ պատը փլվել է եւ մենք չունենք խաղաղություն եւ կայունություն։ Մենք ունենք անորոշություն, որ մեզ տանում է չգիտենք թե ուր։ Բայց եթե մենք շարունակենք անորոշության մեջ ապրել, մենք չենք կարողանա հասնել մեր նպատակներին։ Մեր նպատակները այսօր պետք է լինեն հայրենիք վերադարձի հարցը։ Նորից դեպի տուն, տանող ճանապարհը պետք է լինի մեր ապրելու բանաձևը։ Մենք շարունակում ենք այստեղ ապրել մեր հիշողություններով։ Մեր հիշողությունները մեզ անընդհատ տանում են դեպի մեր նախկին կյանք, դեպի ծննդավայր, դեպի մանկության արահետներ, դեպի ավանդույթներ, դեպի սիրելի մարդիկ։ Հայ օգնության միությունը այսօր էլ ամեն ինչ անում է, որպեսզի արցախցիները ապրեն Հայաստանի հողի վրա։ Կառուցում է տներ, օգնում է ուսանողներին նրանց ուսման վարձի փոխհատուցման համար, օգնում է զոհվածների զավակներին, որպեսզի նրանք կարողանան մեծանալ եւ ապրել ու շարունակել պայքարել իրենց հայրերի կիսատ թողած գործը։
Our next two panelists are joining me here in person. You can find their biographies in the folders that we have provided, but I will introduce our next speaker, who brings an eyewitness perspective on the events surrounding the displacement of Armenians from Artsakh. Gev Iskajian, representing the Armenian National Committee of America, has closely followed and documented the humanitarian consequences of these events. Please join me in welcoming Gev.
Can you hear me? Yes. Perfect. Before I start, I'd be remiss not to thank the Armenian Relief Society. It's okay. You can hear?
You have to get closer.
1-1?
Yeah.
We're gonna hold it.
Yeah.
I'd be remiss not to thank the Armenian Relief Society. When we crossed the Lachin corridor, after 9 months of blockade and siege and aggressive coercion, the first people that we saw once we entered Goris were the ARS. There were kids who were hungry and had water for hours. People who took whatever they can, and sometimes that didn't include an extra pair of clothes, a t-shirt, a warm sweater. But it was the women of the Armenian Relief Society that greeted over 100,000 people that came through that corridor. That was day one. On day two, in Yerevan, at the Armenian Center, they had already begun preparing distribution boxes for sanitary needs, for immediate supplies. And these weren't volunteers who just happened to be in the city. They were members of the ARS that flew in from places like France, the United States, Los Angeles to New York and beyond. To come there and to not just show solidarity, but to provide a solution where they saw problems. So thank you, and thank you to the ARS. It's an honor to be here. When we talk about the ethnic cleansing of Artsakh, the displacement of the women and children that were involved, we often get lost in statistics. The statistics say 75,000 women and children were forcibly displaced from their homes. We talk about the countless women who had children that they couldn't nourish properly because food and supplies were limited. We talk about pregnant women, 90% of whom were diagnosed with anemia during their pregnancy. You talk about the women who lost their sons, lost their husbands, lost more than just a partner, but they now became sole breadwinners, the providers, the protectors of their households. But I don't want to talk about statistics. Today I have the privilege and the podium that many women in Artsakh don't. And I want to talk about them. I want to talk about their stories. So when we first arrived in Artsakh, we had a plan. In 2022, after the war between Azerbaijan and Armenia, we had this understanding that into the future, because of the situation with the Russian peacekeepers, the inability to access Stepanakert or any part of Artsakh by other NGOs, by foreign media, by any groups that can conduct documentation, we saw a massive problem there. And we tried to wrap, as the ANCA, tried to wrap our heads around what type of solution can we provide. And the only thing that we could think of is if there is a lack of access to information, if there's no one to document what's going on, if there's no one to record the atrocities that these women, children, everybody in Artsakh faced, we would never be able to hold anyone accountable. So we decided the only solution was to open up an office in Stepanakert. So the ANCA decided that in 2022, we were going to open up our office with that mission in mind. That we were going to be a voice for those that did not have one, that we were going to shed light where there was darkness, that we were going to, as diasporans, many of you are, we were not going to stand in solidarity with our words, but with our actions. When I arrived, all was relatively normal. And what I mean by relatively normal is the population of Artsakh once in a while had their electricity and gas cut in the middle of the winter. Nothing they're not used to, unfortunately. Once in a while, there were ceasefire violations, and there were shellings of nearby villages, something that the women of Artsakh were not used to, were used to. However, about 8 months into our stay, Azerbaijan closed down the only corridor, only lifeline, only blood vessel that flew into Artsakh, the Lachin corridor. And because of that, all access to the basic necessities any population has. So what is that? Food, medicine, water, supplies, completely cut off. No external route out, no internal route in. And for 9 months, I watched some of the strongest people in the world, not just endure, as an act of rebellion, live the best they could with the means that they had. And what shocked me beyond anything, as someone who witnessed COVID in the United States and saw people fighting each other for, paper towels at Costco or whatever it may be, that these people who had very little were never hesitant to share. Let me tell you the first story that I want to talk about. In Artsakh during the blockade, it was very difficult to acquire food in general. So people would stand in bread lines for 8-9 hours a day. The grocery store shelves, if you ever walked into one, were essentially all empty. And the toughest thing to get were fresh fruit. Because think about this, you've got 10 to 20,000 young children there who need to have a specific nutritional diet. And it was very difficult to meet those needs. We were walking by the store. There was a woman and her husband who came and asked the store owner, do you guys have any fresh fruit? And the store owner goes, no, we're all out, but I think we have 2 bundles of bananas. Do you know what the woman said? And this gave me flashbacks to, those Costco scenes and stuff. She said, we'll take one, somebody else might come and need the other. That is a testament to the women of Artsakh and of Artsakh in general. That was the beginning. Let me talk about what happened toward the end. On the second to last day before people were forcefully displaced from their homes, a friend of mine in Mardin, his wife needed to give birth. Unfortunately, Azerbaijan was shelling the village, the town that they were living in. And how do you do that when, and consider this, you have maybe 2 mid-sized hospitals in all of Artsakh. You've got a small one in Mardin, you've got a larger one in Stepanakert. However, and then you have a shortage of doctors inside the country. And then you have a full-blown war that breaks out. And you have hundreds of men being rushed into those hospital rooms. And it was the female doctors and nurses who I saw soaked in blood with very little medication to offer, very little supplies to work with, that had to deal with all of that. But that aside, my friend's wife, she needed to give birth. Shortage of nurses, where can you do this? And as the bullets were flying down, she and her husband, through some miracle of God, managed to find their way to that hospital. Lo and behold, you don't have enough people to treat everybody because you have so many young men coming in with life-threatening wounds. What happens? One of their neighbors, who's a nurse in Artsakh, as they were shelling the same road that she needed to take to get to that hospital, drove out there and helped her deliver that baby. So when we talk about what women went through in this conflict, I also want to talk about what they not just endured, but the type of strength and grace that they showed, and the type of selfless love that they showed for their people. That being said, I know that today we're here gathered under the theme of ensuring, I believe it's called, and strengthening access to justice for all women and girls. Unfortunately, justice cannot be strengthened where it is not enforced. And access to that justice that we talk about is meaningless when violations carry no consequences. Today I want to talk about what happens when those protections fail. So in September 2023, following 9 months of blockade that deprived 120,000 Armenians of food, medicine, and all the supplies that they need to survive, the entire population of Artsakh was forced to flee, and within days, a 2,000-year-old indigenous community was emptied from its homeland. Among the displaced, tens of thousands of women and girls. But I want to be really clear. This was not an unfortunate byproduct of conflict. It was the foreseeable outcome of sustained coercion, siege conditions, and the military assault against the civilian population. And let's make it even more clear. This isn't just the result of Azerbaijani aggression. It is the failure of an international legal order that was meant to protect women. And international law is not silent on these issues. Under international humanitarian law, the starvation of civilians as a method of warfare is prohibited. Under the 4th Geneva Convention, the forcible transfer of a civilian population is prohibited. Under the Genocide Convention, acts committed with the intent to destroy a national, ethnic, or religious minority, including through conditions of life calculated to bring about its destruction, are prohibited. Under CEDAW, states are obligated to protect women in conflict and ensure equality before the law. Under the guiding principles on internal displacement, displaced persons have the right to voluntarily, safely, and in a dignified way to return. Measured against these standards, what the women of Artsakh experienced was not simply displacement. It was the collapse of every single legal safeguard that was meant to protect them. Let's be clear. When an entire population flees within days, that is not voluntary migration. When mothers stand in bread lines for hours as their children face malnutrition, that is not an internal matter. When a community disappears and its cultural heritage is systematically endangered, that is not post-conflict stabilization. It is forced displacement. And forced displacement that goes unchecked becomes ethnic cleansing. For the displaced women, the consequences are profound and they are enduring. They have lost homes, land, businesses, community networks. Many lost spouses in their prior rounds of violence. They now carry the burden of single parenthood, poverty, psychological trauma, and the legal uncertainty in displacement. Professional women have been stripped of careers. Rural women have lost agricultural livelihoods. Elderly women have been severed from the graves of their families and the churches that anchor their faith. Justice, therefore, must be concrete. And we know what justice looks like. First, the right of return. Return must not be treated as a rhetorical aspiration. It requires enforceable security guarantees, international monitoring, property restitution mechanisms, protection of cultural heritage, and accountability for past violations. Without these, return is merely symbolic, and symbolism does not protect women. So, we have suggestions. UN member states should publicly affirm the displaced population's right to a safe and dignified return. They should support the deployment of a robust international monitoring and protection presence. They should establish and back mechanisms for restitution and compensation. They should insist on the protection of Armenian cultural and religious heritage as a matter of international obligation. Second, accountability. Impunity is the most dangerous structural barrier to justice. Without siege tactics, starvation, and mass displacement result in permanent territorial consolidation without consequence. We send a message globally: the security of women can be sacrificed to geopolitical realities. International investigative mechanisms must be strengthened, evidence must be preserved, violations must be examined through the appropriate judicial avenues, all with the understanding that accountability is not escalation, it is prevention. Third, women's participation. And I say that knowing full well, as a man here speaking on behalf of the people of Artsakh, who cannot do that. No durable peace can be negotiated about Artsakh without the displaced women of Artsakh at the table. The Women, Peace, and Security Agenda is not descriptive language. It is a binding political commitment. And excluding displaced women from the discussions about return, status, security is itself a violation of that commitment. And finally, economic and social justice. CEDAW General Recommendation Number 30 makes it clear that conflict-affected women are entitled to targeted protection and recovery measures. That means sustained international support for housing, employment, psychological care, education, and the protection from gender-based violence. And while humanitarian relief is necessary, it is not justice. So let's confront the uncomfortable truth. When a population disappears and the international response normalizes the outcome, the legal order weakens, and it is women who pay the highest price. The displaced women of Artsakh do not seek miracles. They seek law. They seek the right to live safely in their homes. They seek restoration of their properties. They seek protection of their churches, their schools, and their cemeteries. They seek acknowledgement of the violations they endured. They seek participation in decisions that define their future. Above all, they seek assurance that what happened to them will not happen in the future, and that what happened to them is not irreversible. Ensuring access to justice for all women and girls means refusing to legitimize forced displacement anywhere, because the same legal safeguards that failed the women of Artsakh, have failed the women of Syria, have failed the mothers of Palestine, have failed the daughters of Sudan, and have failed the children of Myanmar. So if we fail here, we don't just fail the women of Artsakh. We weaken the promise we make to every single woman in every single context zone. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gev. Behind every humanitarian program are real people, volunteers, educators, scholars, and community leaders, whose lives have also been profoundly affected by displacement. Our final video introduces Dr. Melania Balayan, a doctor of history and Armenian Relief Society volunteer who was amongst those forced to flee her home in Artsakh.
Ծնվել եմ Արցախում, ինքնակարգ կրթությունս ևս ստացել եմ Արցախում, այնուհետև սովորել եմ Երևանի մանկավարժական պետական համալսարանում մասնագիտություն պատմաբան։ Եվ պիտի ասեմ, որ առհասարակ իմ մասնագիտական գործունեության ընթացքում մշտապես ուսումնասիրել եմ Հայաստանի հայ ժողովրդի պատմությունը, մասնավորապես եւ հատկապես պետք է ասեմ Արցախի պատմությունը։ Այսքան պատմական իրադարձությունների, ինչպես ասում են, խորապատկերի վրա առհասարակ որպես պատմաբանի ինձ համար շատ դժվար է պատկերացնել այն, ինչ որ տեղի ունեցել 2023 թվականի հայ ժողովրդի արցախյան հատվածի հետ։ Որպես պատմաբան ես ինձ թույլ եմ տալիս ասել, որ առհասարակ այն, ինչ տեղի ունեցել 2023 թվականին Արցախի հայության հետ, սա ուղղակիորեն երբևիցե մեր մտքով անգամ չէր կարող անցնել, որովհետև սա աննախադեպ մի իրադարձություն էր եւ ես կասեի առավել շատ աննախադեպ մի ողբերգություն էր, որ երբևէ տեսել է Արցախահայությունը իր հազարամյակների պատմության ընթացքում։ Ընդհանրապես իր ողջ պատմության ընթացքում Արցախի հայությունը կարճած է եղել իր հայրենիքին, իր հողին եւ ամեն գնով եւ բազում դարերի ընթացքում հաղթահարել է բազում դժվարություններ, դիմակայել է բազում արհավիրքների, այսինքն մեր երկիրը բազմիցս փորձել է նվաճել, սակայն արցախցիների բացառիկ հայրենասիրության եւ դիմադրողականության շնորհիվ կարողացել է արցախցին կարճած մնալ իր հայրենիքին։ Այն, ինչ տեղի ունեցավ 2023 թվականին, դա պարզապես աննախադեպ մի ողբերգություն է, որ տեղի ունեցավ մեզ հետ։ Ես իհարկե երբևիցե չէի կարող պատկերացնել, որ արցախցին կարող է լքել իր տունը, իր հայրենի օջախը, բայց ցեղասպանության սպառնալիքը մեր գլխին կախված է, պարզապես։ Եվ այս հանգամանքն է, որ մեզ ստիպեց լքել մեր հայրենիքը։ Սա մի խորը ցավ է, որ մեր հոգում մշտապես առկա է։ Եվ արցախցին, որ զրկվեց իր հայրենիքից եւ այսօր կապ չունի, գտնվում է Հայաստանի Հանրապետության տարածքում, թե փորձել է իր կյանքը դասավորել որևէ այլ երկրում, այնուամենայնիվ իր հայացքը հառած է իր հայրենիքին եւ որքան որ մենք փորձում ենք իրար հետ կապվել, որքան որ մենք քննարկումներ ենք ունենում արցախցիների հետ առհասարակ, բոլորի մոտ ցանկությունը եւ երազանքը մեկն է՝ նորեն վերադառնալ իր հայրենիք։ Այն օրերին, երբ որ մենք շրջապատված էինք պարզապես զինված ադրբեջանական զորքերով եւ երբ 10 ամսյա այդ խուլ շրջափակումից հետո անգամ սննդի կարիքն էր զգացվում Արցախում, մենք պատրաստ էինք մնալ, բայց ցեղասպանության այդ սպառնալիքը մեզ ստիպեց այնուամենայնիվ լքել մեր հայրենիքը, լքել մեր հայրենի օջախը, լքել մեր հարազատների, մեր նախնիների, մեզ համար սրբություն հանդիսացող գերեզմանները եւ այն ցավը, որ մենք ապրեցինք այդ ճանապարհին, դա ուղղակի արցախցիների համար ես կարծում եմ, որ դա անմոռանալի է եւ այսօր էլ ամեն պահ, երբ որ մենք մենակ ենք մնում մեր խոհերի, մեր մտքերի հետ, մենք անպայմանորեն հիշում ենք այդ դառնությունը, որ ապրեցինք այդ ճանապարհը անցնելու ժամանակ, երբ որ ադրբեջանական զինված զորքերը կանգնած ծիծաղում եւ արցախցիներին նվաստացնում էին, դա ուղղակի անմոռանալի է եւ ես չեմ պատկերացրել, որ քաղաքակիրթ 21-րդ դարում մարդիկ այդքան անմարդկային են դարձել եւ կրկնելով պիտի ասեմ, որ երբ որ մենք ուսումնասիրում ենք որպես պատմաբան անգամ նախնադարում, անգամ միջնադարում տեղի ունեցած իրադարձությունները, երբ որ մոնղոլների, սելջուկների տիրապետության պայմաններում մենք կարողացանք դիմակայել եւ ապրել մեր հայրենիքում, այն ինչ որ բացառվեց քաղաքակիրթ կոչված 21-րդ դարում Ադրբեջանի կողմից, սա ուղղակի աննախադեպ է եւ ես կարծում եմ, որ այս ամենը, որ տեղի ունեցել միջազգային այսպես կոչված քաղաքակիրթ երկրների, միջազգային կազմակերպությունների, որոնք կոչված են պաշտպանելու մարդու իրավունքները, սա ուղղակի հեղինակազրկում է բոլորին։ Հայում են փոխում, որ միջազգային կազմակերպությունները, քաղաքակիրթ երկրները իրենց մեջ կգտնեն այն ուժը, այն գիտակցությունը, որ իրենք պետք է այնուամենայնիվ կանգնեն բնիկ ժողովուրդների իրավունքների պաշտպանության կողքին եւ ամեն ինչ անեն, որպեսզի վերականգնվի արդարությունը, այն արդարությունը, որ կորսվել է հենց նաեւ իրենց մեղքով, իրենց թողտվությամբ, իրենց լռությամբ։
As we have heard through legal analysis and eyewitness testimony, the consequences of displacement extend far beyond the moment people are forced to leave their homes. Our next speaker will address the humanitarian response to this crisis and the ongoing needs of displaced families. Areni Hamparian represents the Armenian Relief Society's humanitarian and relief efforts, which have provided emergency assistance, housing support, medical care, and long-term recovery programs for displaced communities. Please welcome Areni.
Okay, you guys can hear. Okay, perfect. Hi, it's wonderful to be with you today. I'm so grateful to be speaking with you about Artsakh, a place all of us really love, and it makes me happy and sad to talk about it, but here we are. So today I want to talk to you about a woman-led organization that has served Artsakh, the wind beneath Artsakh's wings, the Armenian Relief Society. All right, so my agenda today, lessons from my travels in Artsakh, the tempest, and by that I mean the ARS's work, and I refer to it as a tempest of service, and lastly, Artsakh lives, because it still does. So why me? Why am I here talking to you today? I think it's because I fell in love with Artsakh like the ARS did. I had the honor of visiting before the 2020 war twice, and after the 2020 war twice again. It really changed my life, totally altered the trajectory of how I view the world and how I function as an Armenian and as a human being. I learned a lot of things, so I want to talk to you about some of the things I learned. The first one, kindness is truly absolutely everywhere. I remember 2021, I was there by myself and I wanted to feel like a local, so I did the first thing I knew to do, and that was to take the big yellow bus that everyone else was taking off to work, except I just took it to nowhere. And I found that every single time I was on this bus, when it was full and a woman or a girl would enter the bus, a man would always get up and give his seat to her, and I thought that was just the most beautiful thing. In another case in 2022, I was an intern in Artsakh, and I lost my phone, unfortunately not the first time, and I was searching for about half an hour, gave up. I was like, okay, I'm going to be analog the rest of these weeks in Artsakh, but lo and behold, about an hour after, I get a call, and I hear, we've got your phone. And I knew it was this guy who I'd only spoken to 3 times, and you know, he was an acquaintance, but he held to me like a brother, and that really always stuck with me. And lastly, in this picture, my friend took us to his family's village, and we got to visit, and you know, we were prepared to have a feast, and of course when you have an Armenian feast, you have bread, and what do you do in the villages of Artsakh? You don't go to the store, you make your bread. And so this is me making bread for the first time. My dough kneading skills got a 6 out of 10, so it's something I need to work on. Next lesson, history is worn like a skin, truly. When you have to defend your land constantly, when that is something you live through, it's also something you never forget. It's a cost you never forget. So in this picture is bullet holes from the 2020 Artsakh War, and this building is in Jardar, which is a city in Artsakh, and this is a community space / theater. And just to think, you know, kids and adults are walking into this space every single day, and every single time you do, this is what you see. You see the cost of war. And so when you see this every day, it's really difficult to forget it. Next and final lesson, Artsakh is really a magical place. It's really difficult to talk about and describe because it's just the way the sun shines on your skin and the rain in your palms and the dirt beneath your feet. It's a really special feeling. And here is actually these star rocks from this place called Astrashen, which essentially means the place of the stars. And what's so cool is that you go and you scale the hills in Astrashen and you find these naturally occurring star rocks. It just adds on to the magic of Artsakh. So Dushman Vartan, a very famous Armenian freedom fighter, once said, "Love her, your homeland, as you love your father and mother, because our land is the parent of us all." And the ARS really understood this. The ARS understood the beauty of Artsakh, and they strengthened her, they vitalized her, and they didn't fill this void with colorful promises. They filled it with action. So these are only some of the projects that the ARS has taken on. It's incredible. This is not exhaustive. There's more to this list, and I'm just going to be talking about a few of them with you today. So the first one is the ARS Sosek Kindergarten program. So this started in 1998 after the first Artsakh War. A lot of the fathers and families returned returned home and couldn't go back to work. They just weren't in a position. Many were disabled, and this forced many women to go into the workforce. And as a result of that, there was no one to watch the children. So the ARS stepped in, and they opened up the Sose kindergarten. Actually, the first kindergarten was a war-damaged building that the ARS built up and renovated in 1 year, and 87 little 3 to 6 year olds were running around in 1998. So there were 8 schools with 400 students prior to the 2020 war. After the 2020 war, 4 were in occupied Artsakh, another 4 continued to function until Azerbaijan's invasion in 2023. So this is actually a picture from 2022 during my internship. I think we caught them at a bad time. It was lunchtime, and they weren't happy to see us, but the cutest, chubbiest cheeks you'll ever see. And this I found in the archives. It's a picture from 2000, a very glamorous kindergarten party going on in Ashan, which is in the Marduni province in Artsakh. Just goes to show, the ARS and the Sose kindergartens have been around for a very long time, over 2 decades. Next up, so as Lili mentioned in the video prior, as Gev mentioned, Azerbaijan a lot of the time would cut the gas to Artsakhis, making life incredibly unpredictable. They even installed a valve to make it easier for them. And so what did the ARS do? They stepped in and they decided that they would install solar water heaters so that the people of Artsakh could live their life on their terms and not on the terms set by Azerbaijan. So a very, very important project that was taken on. And this is actually the ARS body coming to meet with residents of Artsakh. It's incredible, they function as a collective outside of the homeland. They also function on the ground inside of the homeland. The perfect combination. And the last project I'm going to talk to you about today is Hertz of Hope. And so, as we've all come to understand, the people of Artsakh were left with whatever they could bring with them once they were forced to leave. And as a result of that, many of them didn't have homes. They didn't have places to go. If they were lucky, they stayed with their family. And if they didn't, you really were relying on yourself. And so the ARS again steps in, and they're providing homes for displaced Artsakh families. These are in the Shirak province in Armenia, and what they're essentially doing is creating like Artsakh villages so that the people of Artsakh and Artsakhis can live together, continue to speak the dialect, continue to practice traditions, and to try to create a little Artsakh outside of home. And so far they've already given 10 homes. So the project is well underway. And this is ARS members at the home blessing of an Artsakhi family's new home. And these are 4 pictures during the mass exodus in Artsakh. As you can see, the ARS is everywhere. As people mentioned, people flew from across the world to go to Armenia and to help the people of Artsakh. Nothing is above or below the ARS. They do what they need to do. And so the ARS has just always been there for Artsakh unconditionally, and they have done what is in the mission, but instead of just talking about it, they've always done it. They give, and they give, and they give again. So I always like to, wrap up presentations with action items. So if you're not already, join the ARS. We are active in 26 countries. Yes. It's just an absolutely wonderful time. And if you do not have a chapter near you, guess what? You're in luck. You can create one. All you need is 5 people, and you can begin to create a force of goodness in your little pocket of the world. Next up is to visit Armenia. Truly, I think the best thing you can do to understand the situation is to speak with our brothers and sisters in Armenia, to understand their trials, their tribulations, their pains, their struggles. And what you can do here is you find your path to giving. You understand, hey, these are my strengths and this is how I can help my people. And lastly, donate. There are so many projects that you can donate to. And to take it one step further, organize a fundraiser. So many fun ways to do that. And it brings Armenians together to support our homeland. Great ways to do that. So, it was in 2024, I had met with my friend from Artsakh, and I was talking to him, and I said, I'm really struggling to see the way forward. We've lost Artsakh. I don't know what we do from here. And he looked at me and he said, Artsakh lives in the people of Artsakh. And this really stuck with me, because it meant that the soul of Artsakh is still alive. And although we have lost the sacred piece of our homeland right now, Artsakh still lives. And that also means we have a responsibility to protect it. So the ARS has constantly served as the wind beneath Artsakh's wings and constantly serves as an example to us all. And so I ask you to serve Artsakh without reservation, to become a tempest of service, and to uplift Artsakh. Let's do that together. Thank you.
Thank you, Armenian. So we have a few minutes for questions. I do have a few for our panelists, but I do want to open it up to the floor first as well. I'm just going to bring Kevod back on. Can get the Zoom. Kevod, can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you.
For any of the panelists. Okay, we have one question.
Actually, it's not a question. I would like to confirm, when we were in Artsakh 2017, my daughter lost her phone. Yes. And after 3 weeks, they sent it to New York. And it was Zimborer Kaderer. Artsakhi Zimbornerener. You took me back there. So that's why I would like to share it, not just one person. Color Artsakhinere Harusten Irens Hokiov.
Question in the back.
Hi, Baref. I'm not Armenian, but I grew up with a large Armenian diaspora in Germany. Myself, I'm Kurdish. It's nice to meet you. Thank you for your stories. Unfortunately, I don't have any connection to a phone, which I got lost. But first of all, it was important to me to express my solidarity with the Armenian folks, especially during the war on Artsakh, because from our observation as the Armenian diaspora in Germany, as well as the Kurdish diaspora in Germany, we are working more or less together with each other. We recognized a few years ago during Artsakh that the war on Artsakh always was framed as a territorial struggle or as a case of territorial sovereignty. And I was wondering, especially from the positionality as a woman, what does it mean to you to speak about Artsakh not only as a territorial conflict, but also as a struggle over life, especially if we take a look on Armenian history, for example. And thanks again. I spread my solidarity again. I hope to listen to you further.
Danny, you want to answer that one?
It's difficult. I have never actually been in war. I've never actually felt it. So I think the closest I got to was in 2022 in Mardaket. There was a ceasefire breach. And actually, this brings me back. So there's a ceasefire breach, and as an American, you're like, wow, that is, that just doesn't happen. In America, things like this don't happen. And so this was very different for me. And I remember we were rushed to the local hotel, and then we went back to the office, and everyone was sort of typing away and working as if everything was normal. And I remember looking out the window and just seeing a little kid riding his scooter across the church. And it really just reminded me that, unfortunately, for the people of Artsakh, war is not something that happens here and there. It happens all the time. And that's not normal. I think sometimes when you hear about it happening all the time, you think to yourself, well, it's normal, they're used to it, or something like that. You sort of become detached because it's not your world, but it's really not. And I think we need to remember that. And some of the stories that Gev was talking about, I don't think any human, man or woman, should ever be needed to be put in that position. And so it's painful to talk about these things. It's painful to see people tested to their limit. But this is the world we live in. And unfortunately, it's a loss that we were dealt. But again, the people of Artsakh are the most resilient people I've ever met in my life, and I really do believe that we will go back one day.
Thank you so much to all three panelists. I don't know who can answer my question, but I just wonder what is being done to help women and girls of Artsakh to have a voice, especially like the widows and wives of fallen soldiers and POWs. And are there any projects to help them become providers for their families and for themselves, such as teaching them a trade or helping them start a business to support themselves and their families? Thank you.
Thank you. Keva, do you want to answer that one?
I would like to comment actually on the first question, then I will move to the second one. And thank you for the question. If I heard it correctly, it was about the territorial conflict. I would like to emphasize that the Artsakh issue should not be framed as a conventional territorial dispute between two states over a parcel of land. The core question was the right of the indigenous Armenians of Artsakh to determine their political status and to live in security in their historic and ancestral homeland. So it was about the right of self-determination, and it wasn't mainly and only territorial dispute. The OSCE's Minsk framework, which dealt with the conflict for 30 years and they were responsible for the negotiations, the Minsk group itself recognized this by treating the self-determination as a central principle and by proposing interim self-governance, security guarantees, and a future legally binding determination of the final status. So the territorial integrity was part of the equation, but it was not the whole equation. Legally and politically, Artsakh was a self-determination conflict, with a territorial dimension, not merely a territorial conflict. And so we cannot merely reduce it at its core to only territorial dispute, but rather it's a self-determination. And let's not forget that the self-determination is a fundamental right, human rights, while the territorial integrity is a rule, and it is mainly intended towards other states not violating the territorial integrity of other states. It is not about people demanding their independence or self-determination from an already existing political entity. So we need to differentiate between the right, the fundamental human rights, and the principle. For the second question, I'm aware that the ARS is engaged in similar projects supporting the women on a small scale businesses. I'm aware of AYF's Verelk project, where women were part of initiatives aiming to empower them so they can generate business and generate income and have sustainable sources of income. I'm aware of other NGOs who are supporting women in Artsakh, especially those who are still displaced in different, especially the rural parts of Armenia. However, I should acknowledge that this work is not coordinated, or it doesn't have the support it deserves, or it doesn't have the backing of the state or the government of Armenia, which is really unfortunate.
Thank you, Kevin. And before we close, Gib also wants to answer the question.
Thank you. I would answer that question by saying a mother who has 3-4 children to raise it should be the duty of the state to make sure that she doesn't have to keep up a full-time job and come home to another full-time job, which is raising children and dealing with that. So I think there's a failure that we need to acknowledge there. In terms of capacity building, I think the ARS has worked on this in terms of viable skill sets that can provide tangible and material outcomes. But I would say to even put that dependence on a single parent mother who is widowed to then go and have a job and do all those things. I think as a state, as an Armenian people, we should not be proud that that condition exists, and we should aim to meet it. And lastly, in terms of what opportunities there are for the women of Artsakh, it broke my heart today a little bit. We have our Rising Leaders program in Washington, D.C. this week, where we bring in young folks all across the country, and we take them to the Capitol, and we teach them how to advocate for their rights, for the right of return of Artsakh, for the Armenian genocide, whatever it may be. And this week, and while it did break my heart to leave, when the ARS calls, I answer, so I'm very glad to be here. But this week we had someone special there. It was a girl from Artsakh who is currently at Harvard studying international law, and she embodies so much of what I think of Artsakh and what I think of the women of Artsakh, because when I spoke to her and I said, what's the purpose of this? Like, why do you want to get active in terms of political advocacy and stuff? She said, I don't want people to come and save us. I want the means to do it myself. And I love that self-determined mindset. So sometimes we don't need to come in and provide them everything. Sometimes we need to give them opportunity, and they will take it all the way home.
Thank you, Gib. Thank you again for joining us. As we conclude today's discussion, let us remember that displacement is not only a humanitarian issue, it is a matter of justice. For 116 years, the Armenian Relief Society has worked in the spirit of solidarity with volunteers who are not distant responders to crisis, but members of the very communities that they serve. Many of our volunteers today are themselves displaced from Artsakh, even as they continue to provide relief and support to others whose needs are even greater than their own. This reality reminds us that humanitarian work is not only about aid, it is about solidarity, resilience, and dignity. Thank you to our distinguished speakers and to all of you for being part of this important discussion. Have a great evening.
Thank you very much. Have a good night.
Thank you. Since its inception, like 1910, it gave birth because of the hardship, because of our soldiers were fighting, and then we faced the genocide. Never crossed our mind that in this time and age, the history will repeat itself, and we will face the same trauma and atrocities. But what gave me hope, listening to you, Armenian, keep on talking, telling the story, and I am sure ARS is behind every hopeful action, and we will stand by our people wherever is needed. Just God bless our nation.
Attention CSW, it's 8 o'clock. All meeting rooms should be empty by now. It's 8 o'clock. All meeting rooms should be empty by now. Thank you and have a good night.
Okay, good night. We would like to present you. This is not really a gift, but I will open one of them.